On today's episode of Locked On Wild, another injury blow. This the biggest of the season as Kirill Kaprizov is going under the knife.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day. And we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day as well. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there is no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we will discuss the big breaking news today that Kirill Kaprizov is going to have surgery to repair the lower body injury that kept him out of the lineup for a extended portion earlier this season. We'll talk about the implications with him out of the lineup, deadline potential deals. We'll talk about all of that here on today's show. Obviously, not going to bury the lead because seeing the title here of today's episode, everybody knows Kirill Kaprizov is going back on the shelf. As it was reported today, Bill Guerin confirming that Kirill Kaprizov is going to be out week to week with the same injury that kept him out of the lineup earlier this season. Surgery is going to happen. Michael Russo saying that according to sources to him, the surgery is going to happen on Friday. It is not a season-ending surgery. It's going to be at minimum, from what Bill Guerin said, a minimum of 4 weeks. But it could obviously be a longer time frame than that. So earlier this season, right around Christmas, coming back from the Christmas break, Kirill Kaprizov initially was held out of the lineup. Reports back then were that he was a little banged up, that the team was trying to give him some extra opportunities to rest and to just heal up. And that stretched through most of the month of January. Kaprizov came back for 3 total games. And after the game against Utah, said that he had something that was going on that he didn't want to talk about, but that it wasn't good. And that is a pretty alarming thing to hear an athlete say. So Kaprizov comes back into the lineup, and the initial speculation in watching him play was that it just didn't look Kaprizov-ish when he was out there on the ice. And first game back after an extended absence, you're able to kind of pass it off as, well, he's just getting the rust off. It's just going to take him a little bit to get up to speed, so to speak. But it lingered. It continued. And it just didn't seem to be getting better. And that led us to today, where we get the cryptic announcement initially that Bill Guerin was going to have a press conference at 11 a.m. to update on Kirill Kaprizov's status. And then we learn that it's going to require surgery. So this leads us to, I think, what the issue was all along. Now, obviously not knowing, and we're not going to know the entire timeline here, but let's just kind of connect from A to B to C. So Kaprizov suffers this injury earlier in the season. And it seems pretty likely, based off of what happened since, that surgery was always on the table. And that was one of the options, but it wasn't necessarily the only option. And that the team opted to go with rest to see if that would help. Kaprizov came back and played in 3 games. It didn't work. So now surgery is going to be what is required in order to get him back to 100%. And some other quotes that we'll pull from the presser here earlier today. Big shout out to Jesse Pierce, who is going to be giving the Twitter assist to Locked On Wild here today. Jesse Pierce says, John Hines said Kaprizov was battling through pain and discomfort even at times in the bench in his 3-game return. Hines said, quote, he was struggling to get through it. He did, and we did everything we could to try to see if it would work for him, but it didn't. So the hope was that the rest was going to solve this. It clearly did not. And so the team is, again, taking we're not going to sacrifice long-term health for a potential for a playoff push this year. So they're going to go with the surgery to get this fully cleaned up and fully corrected. We have not officially heard what the injury is as of yet, but I think we pretty much know based off of what has happened. And it has been reported that it is a groin issue for Kaprizov, which tracks. You know, you have maybe a slight tear or a severe pull in that groin muscle, and you try to stay off it. You try to rest it to see if that can, take care of the inflammation and the discomfort. Clearly didn't. And I'm not trying to suggest that Kaprizov maybe tore it more by coming back and playing, but clearly him at 60% was not going to be enough to justify him being on the ice. Now, where did you get that 60% number from? That was used in the presser today. According to Bill Guerin and John Hines, Kaprizov is very upset, said that he could probably get by in games, but it would only be at about 60% of his normal effectiveness. So I think the best thing to do is to shut them down right now for a little while, fix the problem, and then get back to 100%, which is the right approach to take. Now, what does that mean for the timeline? Well, all that time that I spent saying about how I'm not a huge fan of the Four Nations face-off, I am now the biggest fan of the Four Nations face-off. Because if the surgery is done on Friday, you then could theoretically, if it's 4 weeks, Friday will be January 31st. So theoretically, Kaprizov will miss at minimum the entire month of February, and maybe we'll be back right around the trade deadline, March 7th. How many games are you missing in that stretch? You're missing the 2 games before the surgery at Toronto and at Montreal back to back. You're missing those 2 games. After that, 1, 2, 3, 4 pre-Four Nations face-off games, and 4, 5, 6, probably 6 after the Four Nations face-off, if we are going with March 7th as kind of the timetable. So all told, missing like 6, potentially 5 or 6 weeks and missing 10 games is about as best case scenario as you can possibly get. So thank you, Four Nations face-off, for occurring this year and allowing a breather from the 8th to the 22nd. Basically 2 full weeks of no games. Still, the opponents that you play at Toronto, at Montreal, at Ottawa, at Boston, home against Carolina, home against the New York Islanders, at the Red Wings, home against the Red Wings, at Utah, at Colorado, home against Boston, at Seattle, and potentially at Vancouver. It's thankfully mostly Eastern Conference teams, but there are still some key games mixed in that you would love to be able to put in your back pocket, especially that Thursday, Friday back-to-back against Utah and Colorado, and then that game against Vancouver on the 7th. So this is probably, of the different scenarios, this is probably best case scenario of what could have transpired with this situation, but it's still not great. You are missing one of the, biggest impact players in the NHL, who is going to be on the shelf for the foreseeable future once again, after you just navigated a stretch with him out of the lineup in hopes that he'd be able to return and inject some life into the team. We've got a lot to discuss as we continue our breakdown of Kirill Kaprizov, set for surgery on Friday. Kaprizov expected to miss a minimum of 4 weeks. We have a lot more breakdown to get to here on today's episode of Locked On Wild. We'll start with what this means for potential trades and cap maneuverability. That's on the way after this here on Locked On Wild. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. 1 game, 2 teams, endless possibilities. And there is no better way to make every play way more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the Super Bowl MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. We will have a postcast for you Wednesday night after the game against Toronto. No postcast, or actually we will be able to do a postcast for you on Thursday too. So Wednesday, Thursday, we got you covered for postcasts after those games. And then I'll let you know definitively for Saturday as we get closer. So Wednesday, Thursday for sure. TBD on Saturday. But continuing to break down the big news today, Kirill Kaprizov out a minimum of 4 weeks with a lower body injury that he will have surgery to correct. Let's move before we get into, because you got to take 2 angles for this. Who is there pressure on to fill that void? That's 1. So that'll be segment 3 today. And what does this mean for the ability to do anything the rest of the season? I'm going to defer to Michael Russo on this because there's a little wrinkle in here that is going to frustrate a lot of people. As Michael Russo tweeted earlier today, as we report, this is not a season-ending injury, which means the Minnesota Wild won't be able to use long-term injured reserve to make a big trade at the deadline with Kaprizov's space. Why is that? So let's take a look at the scenarios in which this is played out that gain a lot of the attention. The Vegas Golden Knights and the Tampa Bay Lightning. Nikita Kucherov and Mark Stone both suffered long-term injuries during respective seasons. They were put on long-term injured reserve. Done for the year. potential to come back for the postseason. So because they were going to miss the entirety of the rest of the regular season, their teams could go above the cap and add particular pieces because they did not have to get cap compliant because it was going to take the rest of the season. So they went out and added whatever, and no salary cap in the postseason. So those two miraculously were ready to go for the playoffs and were able to play, and shocker, super effective in both instances in helping their teams to make deep runs in the playoffs. The Minnesota Wild, why they're playing this way is kind of one of those things that's annoying, considering the rule maneuvering that other teams frequently do. It's like, why can't you guys just do the same thing? Is part of my thought process here. But the other part of it is this. You really can't afford to just say, we're going to have Kirill just be on the shelf for the rest of the season, because they're going to need Kaprizov to get into the postseason. We've seen how this team has operated. They've played very well in select games with Kaprizov on the shelf. They've racked up some really quality wins against top-level teams, so you can't take that away from them at all. But we have also seen the tendency for this team to not have anybody show up or step up into that role. And they have had many games without Kirill on the ice in which they have just been throttled off the ice, on and off the ice. You're going to need Kaprizov to get you into a postseason spot. He's not going to have... going out and getting a player like Brock Besser, if you would say we're going to use Kaprizov's $9 million cap hit for the rest of the season to go get somebody, Besser's not going to have the same impact that Kirill does. Brock Nelson's not going to have the same impact that Kaprizov does. You need to have Kaprizov on the roster, and in order to be able to do that, you have to be cap compliant before he's activated. If he is indeed put on, and I would imagine he will be, considering he's going to miss, as we laid out, minimum of 10 games and at least 24 days. So he will be put on long-term injured reserve, but what that's going to allow you to do is have flexibility to make some roster moves. That's what putting Kaprizov on long-term injured reserve is going to allow you for now. The other part of this, too, is that by utilizing long-term injured reserve, the Wild, once again, are not going to accumulate cap space. So this is just, we're seeing just yet another doomsday scenario for this team, to where they are hamstrung to the point that they can't afford to call players up. If the Wild want to have an extra forward for tomorrow and Thursday and the rest of the road trip, they have to put Jonas Brodin or Kirill Kaprizov on long-term injured reserve immediately, because they don't have space to call anybody up. And just once bend the rules. But we both, all of us, know full well what would happen if the Wild attempted to do the same thing that Vegas and Tampa Bay did. If the Wild tried to do that, Gary Bettman would throw the book at them, and that rule would be written out of the rule book. That's just how it works. If you're going to penalize a team for trying to backload contracts after they're signed, then you're definitely going to penalize them for all sorts of different things, Like, let's be real here. This would be a situation that that would seek swift revenge from the NHL. It's not to say that a trade is out of the realm of possibility. But what you're going to have to do, you're going to have three things happen. You're going to have the team that you're trading with retain a large portion of the salary, probably 50% at minimum. You're going to have a broker team retain the other portion of that. And you're going to have to move somebody off the roster. So if you can satisfy those three conditions, you can still make trades. You can't make a trade without all three of those being satisfied. So we are in very treacherous waters here. Again, full emphasis. It's not impossible. Trades are not going to be impossible. They're just going to be very difficult, and you have to satisfy all of these conditions in order to make them happen. Because you can't afford to take on any salary. Because you would have to give it up to get Kirill Kaprizov back on the roster, since it's not a season-ending injury. Now let's finish with arguably the biggest question in the fallout here is who the bleep is going to step up to fill the shoes of Kirill Kaprizov. We'll talk that out as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. And once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow us on your favorite audio platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the course of the week. So, no Kirill Kaprizov. What is the lineup going to look like? Let's start with the top line. Thankfully for the Minnesota Wild, they had a top line combination when Kaprizov was out the first time that actually clicked fairly well, at least on offense. So it would not surprise me at all if the Wild go back to Matt Boldy, Marco Rossi, and Matt Zuccarello as their top line. That combination in the 159 minutes that they've played together this year scored 11 goals in 14 games. That was good for a 4.14 goals for per 60 minutes. I'm not talking about expected goals, based off of your level of effort, the things that you do. I'm talking about the actual goals that you score. 11 goals in 14 games for that combination, which is 11th in the league, tied with Philly's combination of Paling, Lawton, and Hathaway at 4.14 goals per 60 minutes, which is pretty good. Tied for 10th. The worry there is the fact that that combination has also been responsible for 8 goals against in the 14 games. So that is 3.01 goals against per 60 minutes, which is not great. And if you look at the numbers compared to the Kaprizov-Rossi-Zuccarello combination, in 100 more minutes, the Kaprizov-Rossi-Zuccarello combination has given up 1 more goal, but they've also scored 6 more goals. And it's the Boldy-Rossi-Zuccarello combination did some really good things together, but we all know that is not the big question. What does the top line look like is not the big question for this Minnesota Wild team. It's what does the second line look like? And let's just roll through some of the combinations that we've seen so far this year. Ironically, the third line combination of Marcus Foligno, Freddie Gaudreau, and Ryan Hartman has the best goals for per 60 minutes of any line this team has had. 4.87 goals for per 60 minutes. They've scored 5 goals for in 61 minutes played together. They've also only given up 1 goal in that time frame. So that's been a pretty impressive combination, those 3 together. But I don't know if you're going to be able to go to that, considering the options that there are for the second line, because Marcus Johansson is out. Update today, he is not going to travel with the team on the road trip. So Marcus Johansson is not really close to returning. So at this point, you really don't have a choice but to put Ryan Hartman, because Ryan Hartman represents a player that will shoot the puck. I think it's pretty safe to say that Liam Ogren is going to get one of those second line spots just based off of who's out of the lineup right now. But who is that other spot opposite Joel Eriksson Ek? That's going to be the big question for this Minnesota Wild team. And it's a question that they have to get clarification on, because you know full well that teams are going to load up against Boldy, Rossi, Zuccarello, as they have all throughout the season. And there isn't a line combination other than, there isn't a line combination for Joel Eriksson Ek that has played meaningful minutes this year that does not involve either Matt Boldy or Marcus Johansson. Joel Eriksson Ek has played almost all of his minutes this season with either Marcus Johansson or with Kirill Kaprizov and Matt Zuccarello. So I'm going to be fascinated to see what these line combinations look like, because you are in desperate need of that second line to show pulse. Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Matt Zuccarello have played a total of 23 minutes together across 9 games. They did not score. They did not give up any goals in that time. And if we look at the expected goals of that combination, it hasn't been what I would call super successful. So you're going to probably have to try some things here. You're going to have to, this is John Hines' time to shine, to mad scientist these line combinations together to see if he can find something that works and that leads to goal production and leads to something that is going to keep this team afloat in the interim. Because a lot of these different combinations just have not really had a ton of success. Boldy, Eriksson Ek, and Zuccarello has an expected goals for per 60 minutes of 1.82. That's not great. And other combinations just have not played enough together to be able to form any level of opinion on what they bring to the table. So who is going to have to step up in the interim? Matt Boldy's got to take the lead again. Matt Boldy's got to be the top dog. He did this when Kirill missed a month a couple of seasons ago, courtesy of Logan Stanley. Matt Boldy's got to step up and be top dog. Marco Rossi has to help him out. Marco Rossi has had a great season. He's going to need to elevate his game a little bit here over these next 4 to 6 weeks. Matt Zuccarello has got to continue to be as good as he has been so far this season. That trio is non-negotiable. Those are now your top players on offense. They got to just step up and rise to the occasion. I know Joel Eriksson Ek is dealing with injury right now, but he's got to find a way to elevate a little bit from an offensive perspective. And the Wild have to do a good job, too, of putting him in positions to deflect those shots right in front of the net. You got to allow him the opportunity to get to the net. You got to get the puck to the net for rebounds and deflections. But one guy in particular that I think is really going to have to elevate, because he's going to most likely be asked to play now a top 6 role going forward, it's Ryan Hartman. 7 goals in 45 games so far. That we're gonna need over these next 4 weeks. That would be a great time to double that goal output. 3 players can't do it. 3 players by themselves are not going to be able to make this work. This has got to be a collective team effort. And John Hines is going to have to pull as much as he can out of this roster to keep this thing where it's at right now. They have shown the ability to do it at points so far this season. But you now are right in the thick of the rest of the Central Division. You have Colorado breathing down your neck. You are chasing Dallas now. Winnipeg is starting to distance themselves. Like, this is gut check time for the Minnesota Wild right now. And we are going to see over these next 4 to 6 weeks, we are going to see if this team rises to the occasion and takes this as a challenge and understands the severity of the situation and what is going to be required for them to get through this, or this is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. That's the reality of the situation. We're not being pessimistic. We're not being gloom and doom. That is just the reality of the situation that this team finds themselves in right now. Is the equity that we talked about has by and large been used up for the previous stretch of navigating through injuries. You don't have much of it left. It is gut check time for the 2024-2025 Minnesota Wild right here, right now. So we'll buckle in and guide you every step of the way, but it starts tomorrow against a very tough Toronto Maple Leafs team on the road. So every single Minnesota Wild player up and down that roster, it's mirror time. Take a look in that mirror and ask yourself, do I have 5% more? Do I have 10% more to be able to add to the mix? And we will see if they do. Thanks for tuning into today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day and part of your everyday routine. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.